Poor black maid saw everyone ignore the billionaire's deaf daughter until she spoke to her through sign language. Grace Williams stood frozen in the doorway of the library, her cleaning supplies clutched in trembling hands. It was her first day at the Hartwell residence, and she was already witnessing something that made her heart constrict. The little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sat in the corner of the room, rocking back and forth, her small hands pressed against her ears. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out, just silent, gasping breaths that shook her thin shoulders. Around her stood 4 adults, all talking at once. "Lily, sweetie, you need to calm down," Mrs. Moritz said, her voice rising with each word as if volume would somehow penetrate the child's distress. A woman in an expensive blazer, probably a therapist, crouched near Lily but didn't touch her. "Lily, can you look at me?" "Look at me, honey." The tutor, a young man with a tablet, gestured wildly toward a screen showing pictures. "Point to what you want, Lily. Just point." The nanny stood back, arms crossed, shaking her head. "She gets like this. There's nothing we can do but wait it out." Grace watched the scene, and something ancient and painful stirred in her chest. She recognized that isolation, that soundless scream. She'd seen it before, years ago, in another pair of desperate eyes. Without thinking, Grace stepped forward. Mrs. Moritz turned. "Oh, you shouldn't, Grace. Just wait outside until..." But Grace was already moving. She set down her supplies, walked slowly toward the corner, and knelt on the expensive Persian rug about 5 feet from the little girl. Close enough to be seen, far enough not to overwhelm. Then Grace raised her hands and signed, smooth and deliberate, "Are you okay?" The library went silent. Lily's rocking stopped. Her hands slowly lowered from her ears. Her red-rimmed eyes, bright with unshed tears, locked onto Grace's face, then moved to her hands, then back to her face. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Lily's small hands moved, hesitant, like a person reaching for something they're afraid will disappear. "You can see me?" she signed back. Grace felt her throat tighten. She nodded and signed again. "Yes, I see you." Lily's face crumpled, but this time not in distress. In relief, in recognition, in something that looked like hope breaking through stone. "Nobody sees me," Lily signed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Nobody." Grace's own eyes burned. She signed slowly, carefully. "I see you now." Behind them, the 4 adults stood speechless, watching something they couldn't understand but could feel. Something profound breaking open in that expensive penthouse library. Connection, a bridge, a language beyond words. 2 invisible people seeing each other for the first time. Before we proceed, permit me to welcome you, my lovely family, to another heartwarming story. If you're new here, we wholeheartedly welcome you. To cement your place in this community, please hit the subscribe button now. Don't also forget to hit the notification icon bell to ensure you are the first to see our new story tomorrow. The alarm screamed at 4:30 a.m., but Grace Williams was already awake. She'd been awake for 20 minutes, lying in the darkness of her small Bronx apartment, mentally calculating. Rent was due in 6 days. Marcus needed new shoes. His toes were cramping in the old ones. The electric bill sat on the counter, red-stamped and urgent. And now, this new job at the Hartwell penthouse, her 3rd position this week, the one that might, just maybe, if she could keep it, mean the difference between making it and going under. She rose in the darkness, moving quietly past Marcus's bedroom. Through the thin door, she could hear his breathing, deep and steady. 12 years old, and already he worried about her. Already he'd learned to make himself small, to need less, to understand that his mother's exhaustion wasn't indifference but love stretched across too many hours, too many jobs, Too many impossible choices. In the bathroom mirror, Grace studied her reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. 34 years old, but some mornings she felt 60. The lines around her eyes had deepened this past year. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Baby, you're carrying too much." But what choice did she have? Single mothers didn't get the luxury of laying burdens down. She thought about James as she braided her hair. Her little brother would have been 29 now. 5 years since the pneumonia took him, and she still reached for her phone sometimes to text him, still turned to sign something funny before remembering the empty space where he used to be. James, who'd been born deaf into a world that mostly didn't want to learn his language. James, who'd taught her that communication was about so much more than sound. James, whose death had left her with a skill she rarely used anymore but could never forget. The subway at 5:45 a.m. was a different world. Night shift workers heading home, early morning cleaning crews heading out, all of them carrying the weight of invisible labor. Grace recognized the exhaustion in every face. They were the people who made the city function, who cleaned the offices and watched the children and delivered the food, and most days the people they served looked right through them as if they were ghosts. She changed trains at 125th Street, and with each stop heading downtown, the passengers shifted. More suits, more designer bags, more people who'd never had to calculate whether they could afford both dinner and the subway fare. By the time she emerged at 86th and Lexington, she'd crossed into a different universe. The Upper East Side in early morning light looked like a movie set. Doormen in crisp uniforms, dog walkers with 6 leashes, women in yoga pants that cost more than Grace's monthly grocery budget. She walked past buildings where the penthouses sold for more money than she'd earn in 5 lifetimes, and she thought about stories. The stories that get told and the ones that don't. The lives that matter in the news and the ones that disappear without a headline. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones nobody's paying attention to. But maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why they need to be told. She entered the Hartwell building through the service entrance, as she'd been instructed. A different elevator for staff. A different world, literally separated by walls and floors and the unspoken rules that kept certain people in certain spaces. While Grace rode the subway, Lily Hartwell woke in a bedroom that would make most children weep with envy. A canopy bed with silk curtains. A wall of windows overlooking Central Park. Shelves filled with every toy and book and gadget money could buy. And she was utterly, completely alone. She didn't hear her alarm, of course. She felt it, the vibration under her pillow that told her it was 6:30 a.m. Time to begin another day of being surrounded by people who couldn't talk to her. Lily got out of bed and walked to her art table. This was where she lived, really. Not in the fancy bedroom or the enormous penthouse with its 15 rooms. She lived in her drawings, the only place where she could say what she needed to say. This morning's sketch was dark. Shadowy figures with their mouths open wide, screaming or talking. She couldn't tell which. And in the center, a small figure with her hands over her ears, trying to block out the silence. Because that's what most people didn't understand about being deaf. It wasn't silent. It was loud with all the things people weren't saying to you. Loud with all the conversations happening around you that you couldn't access. Loud with loneliness. Her father appeared in the doorway at 7:15. She knew because she felt the vibrations of his footsteps. Richard Hartwell, the brilliant CEO, the man whose company had revolutionized cloud computing, the billionaire who appeared on magazine covers. He stood there for a moment and she could see him trying to figure out what to say, how to connect, how to be a father to a daughter whose language he'd never learned. He waved. She waved back. He pointed to his watch and then to his briefcase, his face apologetic. Work. Always work. She nodded. She understood, or at least she'd learned to accept it. He blew her a kiss and was gone, his phone already pressed to his ear, already back in the world of sounds and words and deals she could never be part of. Mrs. Moritz came in at 7:30 with breakfast. The older woman smiled too brightly, moved too carefully, spoke too slowly and too loud, as if deafness were a form of intellectual disability. "Good morning, Lily. I brought your favorite pancakes." Each word exaggerated, her mouth opening wide like a cartoon character. Lily wanted to scream that being deaf didn't make her stupid, that she could read lips just fine when people spoke normally, that the exaggeration actually made it harder, not easier. But she'd learned that showing frustration only made them more nervous, more careful, more condescending. The tutor arrived at 9 o'clock. Nice enough man, genuinely trying to help, but he relied entirely on his tablet and his picture cards. Point to what you want. Show me this. Show me that. As if she were a pet being trained rather than a child with thoughts and feelings and things to say that couldn't be reduced to pointing at icons. By 10:30, when her speech therapist arrived, Lily was already tired. Tired of trying to make sounds that felt wrong in her throat. Tired of seeing the disappointment in people's eyes when she couldn't produce the words they wanted. Tired of being the project, the problem, the poor deaf girl who needed fixing. She retreated to her room and drew. She drew her mother, or at least the hazy memory of her. Mama had been learning sign language. Mama had been taking classes, practicing, getting better. Mama had said, "Your language is beautiful, baby, and I'm going to learn it." But then Mama was gone, killed by a drunk driver on a rainy Tuesday, and with her went the only person who'd been trying to meet Lily in her own world. Dr. Moss, the psychologist, came every week. She was kind, patient, and completely ineffective. She'd written in her reports that Lily was emotionally withdrawn and resistant to bonding. But that wasn't true. Lily wasn't withdrawn. She was lonely. There's a difference. You can be surrounded by people and still be completely alone when none of them speak your language. Grace arrived at the penthouse at 11 a.m., her hands still cold from the subway. Mrs. Moritz met her at the service entrance, a clipboard in hand and a look of weary determination on her face. "You're the 5th in 8 months," Mrs. Moritz said without preamble. "The others couldn't handle it. The girl, she's difficult. Special needs. Deaf. She has these episodes." Mrs. Moritz said the word deaf quietly, as if it were a shameful secret. "Mr. Hartwell doesn't like staff getting too familiar. Keep your distance, do your work, don't engage too much." "Understood." Grace nodded, though something in her chest tightened. "Don't engage too much," as if a lonely child were a hazard to avoid. The penthouse was obscene in its luxury. Marble floors that probably cost more than Grace's entire apartment building. Artwork on the walls that she recognized from museum trips with Marcus. Floor-to-ceiling windows with views that made you feel like you were floating above the city. And everywhere, drawings. Taped to walls, scattered on tables, tucked into corners. A child's artwork, raw and honest and heartbreaking. Grace paused at one near the entrance, a small figure in a vast empty space, hands raised as if asking a question no one would answer. She knew that feeling. She'd lived it most of her life, being present but unseen, being necessary but disposable, being human but treated as function. She was cleaning the hallway when she heard, or rather felt, the commotion. Voices rising, footsteps hurrying, that particular frequency of adult panic. She followed the sound to the library and found the scene that would change everything. The little girl, Lily, was having what Mrs. Moritz had called an episode, but Grace recognized it for what it really was. A meltdown born of frustration and isolation. A communication breakdown made physical. The child wasn't being difficult. She was drowning, and everyone around her was offering instructions on how to swim instead of pulling her to safety. Grace watched the adults, all of them well-meaning, all of them useless. They were speaking at the child, not to her. They were treating her deafness like a wall to shout over rather than a language to learn. And the little girl, this tiny person in her designer clothes in her $1 million home, was completely alone. Something in Grace's chest cracked open. She saw James in that corner. She saw every marginalized, overlooked, dismissed person she'd ever known. She saw herself. And before she could think about consequences, about keeping her distance, about the fifth maid in 8 months, Grace acted. She set down her supplies. She walked forward. She knelt down. And she raised her hands and signed the only thing that mattered. "Are you okay?" What happened next, that moment of recognition, that instant of connection, that was the moment everything shifted. Two people, invisible for completely different reasons, suddenly seeing each other with perfect clarity. Lily signed back, and Grace felt her heart break and heal simultaneously, because in that moment she understood. This wasn't just a job. This wasn't just another wealthy family's household. This was a child who needed what Grace had needed all her life. To be seen, to be understood, to matter. And Grace, despite every warning, despite every practical reason to stay distant, despite knowing that caring always costs more than you can afford, Grace decided to see her. After the library incident, something shifted in the Hartwell penthouse. The other staff members looked at Grace differently, a mixture of respect and wariness. Mrs. Moritz had pulled her aside with instructions to continue her cleaning duties. But Grace could see the questions in the older woman's eyes. How did you do that? What did you say to her? Why does she respond to you when she won't respond to anyone else? Grace didn't have simple answers. She only knew that for the first time in 8 months, Lily Hartwell had stopped being the difficult child with episodes and had become simply a child. A lonely, brilliant, desperate to be understood child. The next day, Grace arrived at her usual time and began her assigned tasks. She was dusting the living room bookshelves when she felt it, that particular awareness of being watched. She turned slowly and found Lily standing in the doorway, her small frame still, her dark eyes intense and searching. The girl was testing her, checking if yesterday had been real or just another disappointment. Grace set down her duster and signed, "Good morning." Lily's face transformed. The wariness melted into something like wonder. She stepped into the room, her feet silent on the expensive carpet, and signed back, "You're still here." "I'm still here," Grace confirmed with her hands. Lily moved closer, each step cautious, as if approaching something fragile that might shatter. "Why do you know my language?" she signed. Grace thought about how to answer. She could feel the weight of this moment, the importance of honesty with a child who'd been condescended to her entire life. She lowered herself to sit cross-legged on the floor, putting herself at Lily's eye level, and began to sign her story. "I had a brother named James." Grace's hands moved slowly, making sure Lily could follow. "He was deaf like you. He taught me to sign when I was young, about your age. He died 5 years ago." Lily's eyes widened. She sat down across from Grace, mirroring her position. "I'm sorry," she signed. Then, with the brutal honesty of children, "Do you miss him?" "Every single day," Grace signed back. "Every time I see something beautiful, I want to tell him. Every time something funny happens, I reach for my phone to text him. And then I remember he's gone." "My mama is gone too," Lily signed, her small hands shaking slightly. "Car accident. I was 3. I don't remember her voice, but I remember her hands. She was learning to sign for me." Grace felt her throat tighten. She nodded, acknowledging the shared loss, the parallel grief. Two people connected by absence. Nobody here knows how to talk to me, Lily continued, her signing becoming more animated as words she'd held inside for months, maybe years, came pouring out. They point at pictures. They write things down. They talk really slow like I'm stupid. But I'm not stupid. I'm just deaf. I know you're not stupid, Grace signed. You're brilliant. I can see it in your drawings. Lily's face lit up like sunrise breaking. You looked at my drawings? They're beautiful, and said, but beautiful. Nobody else looks at them. Not really. They say they're nice, but they don't see them. Lily paused, her hands hovering in the air. You see things other people don't see. Grace thought about that, about being a black woman in white spaces, about being a domestic worker in luxury homes, about being present but invisible, essential but dismissible, about how the marginalized develop a particular kind of vision, an ability to see other overlooked people, because they know what it feels like to be looked through rather than at. Maybe, Grace signed, people like us have to see each other, because nobody else is looking. Lily considered this, her young face serious. Then she signed, will you be my friend? Grace's heart constricted. She thought about Mrs. Moritz's warning, about boundaries, about the fifth maid in 8 months, about keeping her job and keeping her distance. But she looked at this child, this isolated, brilliant, hungry for connection child, and she couldn't say no, wouldn't say no. Yes, she signed, I'll be your friend. And just like that, something new began. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine developed. Grace would arrive, begin her cleaning duties, and Lily would appear, drawn by the possibility of conversation. Grace learned to work and sign simultaneously, dusting with one hand while her other hand spelled words, vacuuming in patterns that allowed her to pause and respond to Lily's endless questions. Because Lily had questions about everything. What's the Bronx like? Do you have a family? What's your favorite food? Why do you clean houses? Have you been to the ocean? What does music feel like? The questions tumbled out in a rush of signs, years of curiosity finally finding someone who would answer. Grace told her stories about Marcus and his dreams of becoming an engineer, about her neighborhood with its bodega cats and summer block parties, about taking 2 trains to get to work, about her mother's collard greens and her grandmother's church hats. She told Lily about a world beyond the penthouse, beyond wealth and privilege, a world full of struggle, but also full of life and community and joy that didn't require money. Lily absorbed it all like parched earth absorbing rain. She started following Grace from room to room, not getting in the way but staying close, helping in small ways. She'd carry the cleaning supplies. She'd point out spots Grace missed. She'd reorganize the books Grace dusted, creating patterns only she understood. And her drawings began to change. The dark, isolated figures started to include other elements. Colors brightened. Hands appeared, signing, connecting. One drawing showed 2 figures, one tall and one small, their hands forming the sign for a friend. Grace found it tucked under her cleaning caddy and had to step into the bathroom to compose herself before anyone saw her crying. But happiness, Grace had learned, always came with a price, especially for people like her. Mrs. Moritz cornered her in the kitchen one afternoon, her face conflicted. Grace, I need to talk to you about Lily. Grace's stomach tightened. Here it comes, she thought. The warning, the firing, the end. Mr. Hartwell doesn't like staff getting too familiar with her, Mrs. Moritz said, her accent thickening with discomfort. He's very particular about boundaries, professional distance. You understand. She's a child, Grace said quietly. A lonely child. I know. And what you did that first day, it was wonderful. Truly. But Mr. Hartwell, he's very protective. He doesn't want her getting attached to staff who might leave. This happened before. A nanny 3 years ago. Lily bonded with her. And when she quit, Lily was devastated for months. Grace wanted to say that the problem wasn't staff leaving. The problem was that none of the staff could actually communicate with Lily. That you couldn't bond with someone you couldn't talk to. That isolation wasn't protection. But she held her tongue. She needed this job. Marcus needed new shoes and the rent was due and the electric bill wouldn't pay itself. I understand, she said, though understanding and agreeing were two different things. That night, Grace lay awake in her small apartment, listening to the sounds of the Bronx outside her window. Sirens and music and voices calling to each other in English and Spanish and a dozen other languages. She thought about Lily in her silent penthouse, surrounded by luxury and utterly alone. She thought about herself, surrounded by noise but emotionally isolated. She thought about the stories we tell ourselves about success and worth, about how a billionaire's daughter could be more alone than a child in a one-bedroom Bronx apartment. And she realized something that maybe you've realized too, if you've ever had to choose between what's right and what's safe. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is witness someone else's humanity, even when it costs you, even when it's inconvenient, even when all the practical voices in your head are screaming about consequences. Because some stories need to be lived, not just told. Some connections are worth the risk. She decided to keep seeing Lily, to keep signing, to keep being present. Whatever happened, happened. But she wouldn't abandon this child to loneliness. Not if she could help it. Not even to save her job. The routine continued. Grace cleaned. Lily followed. They signed. They connected. And slowly, carefully, something like hope began to grow in the spaces between them. The crisis came on a Thursday in late September. Grace's childcare fell through, her usual neighbor sick with the flu, and she had no backup plan. She called Mrs. Moritz from the subway, her voice tight with stress. I'm so sorry, but I need to bring my son with me today. Just today. I promise he'll be quiet. He'll sit in the kitchen. He won't be any trouble. There was a long pause. Then, Mr. Hartwell is at his office all day. I suppose just this once. Marcus at 12 was small for his age, quiet, observant in the way children become when they learn early that their behavior might determine whether their mother keeps her job. He carried a backpack full of homework and sat at the kitchen table, exactly as Grace had instructed, working on math problems while she cleaned. But Lily, as Lily always did when something new entered her world, found him. Grace was cleaning the dining room when she sensed the shift. That feeling when your child is no longer where you left them. She hurried to the kitchen and stopped in the doorway, her heart in her throat. Lily stood by the table, staring at Marcus. Marcus looked up at her, his expression uncertain. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Marcus smiled and signed. Hi, I'm Marcus. Lily's face exploded with joy. She signed back rapidly. You know my language. How do you know my language? My Uncle James taught me, Marcus signed. He was my mom's brother. He was deaf. And just like that, as simply as children do everything, they became friends. Grace watched from the doorway as they signed back and forth. Marcus showing Lily his math homework. Lily showing Marcus her drawings. They laughed, the way deaf children laugh, with their whole bodies, silent and joyful and completely uninhibited. Children, Grace thought, didn't see obstacles the way adults did. They didn't see deaf or hearing, black or white, rich or poor. They just saw another kid, another person, another human being worth knowing. For 2 hours, while Grace cleaned the penthouse, the children existed in their own world. Marcus helped Lily with a jigsaw puzzle. Lily showed Marcus her art supplies. They drew together, Marcus signing descriptions of what he was drawing. Lily correcting his hand shapes with gentle patience. Grace had never seen Lily so animated, so present, so absolutely and completely happy, which was, of course, when Richard Hartwell came home early. Grace heard the elevator, heard the footsteps, and her blood turned to ice. She rushed to the living room where the children were sprawled on the floor, surrounded by art supplies, and found Richard standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. Marcus scrambled to his feet, trained by experience to disappear when wealthy employers appeared. Lily looked confused, then defensive, moving closer to Marcus as if to protect him. Richard looked at his daughter, at the strange child in his living room, at Grace hovering anxiously nearby. Something flickered across his face, too fast to read. Anger? Hurt? Confusion. "I see," he said quietly. Then, to Grace, "We'll discuss this later." He turned and walked to his office, closing the door with controlled precision. Not a slam, somehow worse than a slam. Grace gathered Marcus's things with shaking hands. Lily signed. "Is Marcus in trouble? Did I get him in trouble?" "No, sweetheart." Grace signed back, though her heart was pounding. "Everything's fine." But they both knew it wasn't fine. They both knew that something had shifted, that the precarious balance they'd maintained was now disrupted. As Grace and Marcus left through the service entrance, Grace realized that moments like these, the ones where everything hangs in the balance, are the moments that define what happens next. Would Richard see what she saw? Would he understand that his daughter wasn't the problem? Would he recognize that the real issue wasn't staff getting too close, but everyone staying too far away? She didn't know. All she knew was that she'd made her choice. She'd chosen to see Lily, to connect with her, to be present in her life. And whatever consequences came from that, she would face them. Some things were worth the risk. Some people were worth fighting for, even when, especially when, the world told you to look away. Richard Hartwell sat in his home office that night, the door closed, the lights dim, and let himself remember what he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Elena. She'd been the kind of person who made rooms feel warmer just by entering them. Not because she was loud or performative, but because she paid attention. She noticed things. The barista who looked tired. The doorman who mentioned his daughter's graduation. The small moments that most people like Richard, moved through without seeing. When Lily was born deaf, diagnosed at 6 months old, Richard's first instinct had been to fix it. Cochlear implants, the best specialists, cutting-edge treatments. He'd approached his daughter's deafness like a business problem, something to be solved with money and expertise and relentless optimization. But Elena had seen it differently. "She's not broken, Richard," Elena had said, sitting in the hospital with their baby girl in her arms. "She's just different, and different isn't less." Elena had enrolled in ASL classes immediately. She'd bought books, watched videos, practiced signs while cooking dinner, while driving, while falling asleep at night. Richard had watched her hands move and thought, "Later. I'll learn later. When work calms down. When we're through this acquisition. When the IPO is done. When. There was always a when. Always a reason to postpone. Always something more urgent than learning to speak his daughter's language. Elena had been patient at first, then frustrated, then resigned. The resignation had been the worst part. The way she'd stopped asking him to join her at the ASL classes, stopped correcting his excuses, stopped believing he'd ever make time for what mattered most. The memory that haunted him most was from 2 weeks before the accident. Lily had been 3 years old, signing something to him across the breakfast table. Richard had looked at Elena helplessly, and Elena had interpreted, "She wants you to come to her school performance. Tell her I'll try," Richard had said, already mentally reviewing his calendar. Elena's face had hardened. You tell her. Use your hands. Try. But he hadn't. He'd kissed Lily's forehead and left for work, and that had been easier than trying, than failing, than admitting that he'd been too busy to learn the language his daughter lived in. 2 weeks later, Elena was dead, killed by a drunk driver on a Tuesday afternoon, running errands while Richard sat in a board meeting arguing about quarterly projections. The police had come to his office. The words hadn't made sense at first. Elena, accident, hospital, gone. The guilt had been immediate and absolute. If he'd learned to sign, maybe Elena wouldn't have had to run all those errands alone. Maybe they would have been together more. Maybe he would have been a better partner, a better father, a better man. Maybe she wouldn't have been on that particular road at that particular moment when a stranger's bad decision ended her life. In the 3 years since, Richard had thrown himself into work with the kind of intensity that worried his board members and impressed his investors. He'd doubled the company's valuation. He'd expanded into 6 new markets. He'd made Forbes' list of most influential tech CEOs. And he'd become a ghost in his daughter's life. He told himself he was doing it for her, building wealth, securing her future, making sure she'd never want for anything. But the truth he could barely admit in the darkness of his office, was that he was running from the guilt, running from the grief, running from the terrible recognition that he'd failed the 2 people who mattered most. And while he could never make it up to Elena, he couldn't bear to face Lily and see his inadequacy reflected in her eyes. So he'd hired people, the best people, specialists and therapists and tutors and nannies, people who were paid to care, to connect, to fill the space where a father should be. He'd told himself it was enough, that quality care was a form of love, that providing meant something. But watching his daughter light up when she signed with a Maid's son, watching her more animated with the cleaning woman than she'd ever been with him, Richard couldn't lie to himself anymore. He'd given Lily everything money could buy and nothing she actually needed. He'd given her isolation disguised as protection, loneliness disguised as luxury, absence disguised as provision, and worst of all, he'd done exactly what he'd accused the world of doing. He'd looked at his deaf daughter and seen a problem to solve rather than a person to know. He'd seen her disability before her humanity. He'd seen what she couldn't do instead of who she was. Richard opened his laptop and searched for ASL classes. The screen filled with options. Evening courses, weekend intensives, online tutorials. All of them available, all of them had been available for 3 years, waiting for him to make the choice he'd never made. He closed the laptop. Old habits, old excuses. Too busy. Tomorrow, when work calms down. The familiar refrains that had cost him his marriage and his daughter. In another room, Lily was probably drawing, creating art that expressed what she couldn't say to anyone. Well, to almost anyone. Apparently, she could say it to Grace Williams, a woman who cleaned his floors and saw more in 10 minutes than Richard had seen in 8 years. The shame of that was difficult to swallow. October moved into November, and despite Richard's disapproval, despite the unspoken tension, Grace continued to work at the Hartwell penthouse. Richard hadn't fired her after the Marcus incident. He'd simply retreated further into his office, into his work, leaving the household to function around him like a machine he'd designed but no longer operated. And in his absence, something remarkable happened. Lily bloomed, started small, a smile that lasted longer, a willingness to try new foods at dinner, a decrease in the episodes that had defined her existence for years. Dr. Moss, the psychologist, noted the changes in her reports with barely concealed amazement. Significant improvement in emotional regulation, she wrote. Increased engagement with surroundings. Notable decrease in isolation behaviors. What Dr. Moss didn't know What nobody except Mrs. Moritz had figured out was that the change wasn't mysterious. It was Grace. Grace, who arrived each morning and signed, "Good morning, beautiful girl." Grace, who told Lily stories about her neighborhood while folding laundry. Grace, who explained what soul food was and why her grandmother's cornbread recipe was a family treasure. Grace, who described the subway musicians and the bodega cats and the way Marcus's school looked in the afternoon light. Lily absorbed it all. She asked questions that revealed a brilliant, curious mind that had been starved for genuine interaction. What does jazz feel like? Can you feel different kinds of music differently? What's a block party? Why do people dance? What makes a community? How do you know who your real friends are? Grace answered honestly, never talking down, never simplifying beyond what was necessary. She treated Lily like an intelligent person who happened to be deaf, not like a deaf person who might, incidentally, be intelligent. The difference was everything. And Lily, in return, taught Grace things she hadn't expected to learn. Lily showed her the coding games she was mastering, games that would challenge most adults. She explained how she experienced the world through vibrations and visual patterns. She demonstrated how she could feel music through her body when the bass was strong enough. She shared her art and her dreams and her frustrations with an honesty that only children possess. Sometimes, Lily signed one afternoon while Grace was cleaning windows. "I think being deaf is like being a secret agent. I can see things other people miss because they're too busy listening." Grace had paused, struck by the wisdom in that. "Like what?" she signed back. "Like when people say one thing with their mouth, but their body says something different. Hearing people don't always notice. But I have to watch everything, so I see when they're lying or when they're sad or when they're pretending." Grace thought about that, about how marginalization often came with unexpected gifts, how being forced to pay attention made you more attentive, how being excluded from the mainstream meant you developed alternate ways of navigating the world, how limitation could become a kind of superpower if you learned to work with it instead of against it. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe you've been on the outside of something and discovered that the view from the margins shows you things the center can't see. Maybe you've learned that different isn't less, it's just different. And maybe, if you're really lucky, you've found someone who saw that difference not as something to fix but as something to celebrate. Those are the stories we need to hear more of. Those are the connections that change everything. Even Mrs. Moritz began to soften. The older woman started asking Grace to teach her basic signs. "Please, thank you, you're welcome, I see you." Simple phrases, but Lily's face when Mrs. Moritz signed "Good morning" for the first time was worth 1,000 therapy sessions. "You're learning my language?" Lily had signed, her eyes wide. "Trying," Mrs. Moritz had said aloud, then fingerspelled awkwardly, "Tarwayng." Lily had hugged her, spontaneous and fierce, and Mrs. Moritz had teared up in the kitchen afterward, admitting to Grace that in 10 years with the family, Lily had never hugged her before. "I thought she just didn't like me," Mrs. Moritz said quietly. "I didn't understand. She just wanted someone to try, someone to meet her where she was instead of demanding she come to us." The other staff members noticed. The tutor started incorporating more visual and kinesthetic learning. The speech therapist adjusted her approach, focusing less on making Lily sound normal and more on giving her tools to communicate in whatever way worked. Even the chef began asking Lily about her food preferences through simple signs Grace taught him. The penthouse felt different, lighter, more alive, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath and finally exhaled. But Richard noticed none of it. Or if he noticed, he said nothing. He left early, came home late, took meals in his office. He was present physically but absent in every way that mattered. And Lily, who was learning to speak up in sign language, who was finding her voice through her hands, began to show signs of a different kind of frustration. "Why doesn't Daddy want to talk to me?" she signed to Grace one evening. Grace's heart broke. How do you explain to a child that their parents' absence isn't rejection but cowardice? That sometimes adults are so afraid of failing that they don't try at all? That love can be present but paralyzed? "He does want to," Grace signed carefully. He's scared." "Of what?" "Of me. Of not being good enough. Of failing you. Sometimes grown-ups are very silly that way." Lily considered this. "You're a grown-up and you're not silly." Grace smiled sadly. "I'm silly in other ways. We all are. We're all just trying our best and mostly getting it wrong. I wish he would try." Lily signed, her small hands moving with a sadness that shouldn't exist in an 8-year-old. "Even if he gets it wrong, I wish he would just try." Lily's 9th birthday was approaching in mid-November, and the household began preparing with the kind of intensity usually reserved for state dinners. Richard, who couldn't manage daily conversations with his daughter, threw himself into party planning with characteristic excess. Lily, meanwhile, had different ideas. "I want a small party," she signed to Grace one morning. "Not a big one, just people who can talk to me. You and Marcus and Mrs. Moritz. Maybe Dr. Moss. That's all." Grace's chest tightened. "That sounds perfect, sweetheart. But your father might have other plans." "I know," Lily signed, her expression resigned beyond her years. "He always does." Grace tried to intervene gently. She mentioned to Mrs. Moritz that Lily had expressed a preference for a quiet celebration. Mrs. Moritz, newly brave with her basic sign language skills, brought it up to Richard. "Mr. Hartwell, perhaps this year, a smaller gathering? Lily seems to prefer." "I've already hired the entertainment," Richard interrupted, not looking up from his phone. "It's taken care of." "But sir, maybe ask Lily what she—" "I know what's best for my daughter, Mrs. Moritz. She'll enjoy it once she's there. Children always do." Mrs. Moritz had reported this conversation to Grace with a helpless shrug. They both knew what was coming. Another elaborate production that would overwhelm Lily. Another expensive gesture that would miss the point entirely. Another demonstration that Richard Hartwell could buy anything except understanding. Grace suggested quietly through Mrs. Moritz that Richard might learn a sign to give Lily on her birthday. Just one. Happy birthday or I love you, or even just her name. Something in her language. Something that showed he was trying. The message came back through Mrs. Moritz. "Mr. Hartwell appreciates the suggestion but feels his time is better spent ensuring the party is properly organized. His time better spent on everything except what mattered." Grace watched the party preparations escalate. A professional party planner arrived with mood boards and timelines. Caterers discussed a menu Lily wouldn't eat. Decorators transformed the penthouse into a princess fantasy that Lily, who was interested in coding and art, would find juvenile and patronizing. And the entertainment, God, the entertainment. A magician, a balloon artist, a face painter, a princess character performer, none of whom knew a single sign. "It's going to be a disaster," Mrs. Moritz said quietly to Grace the day before the party. "I know," Grace replied, folding tiny princess-themed napkins she'd been asked to arrange. "But maybe he needs to see that. Maybe he needs to understand that money can't solve everything. Or maybe," Mrs. Moritz said sadly, "he'll just blame Lily again, say she's difficult, say she can't be pleased. That was the pattern, wasn't it? When you refused to see someone's actual needs, when you substituted what you thought they should want for what they were telling you they needed, you could always blame them when your solutions failed. It was easier than admitting you'd never listened in the first place." Lily spent the evening before her birthday drawing. Grace found her in her room, creating an image that would haunt Grace for weeks afterward. A small figure surrounded by enormous, looming shapes with wide-open mouths. And in the corner, tiny and alone, a figure signing into empty space. The title, written in Lily's careful handwriting, "Nobody Hears." Grace wanted to scoop this child up and take her away from all of it. Take her to the Bronx where birthday parties meant dollar store decorations and homemade cake and cousins running wild in tiny apartments, where nobody had much but everybody showed up, where people were seen because there wasn't enough money to substitute things for presents. But she couldn't, because this was Lily's life, and this was Lily's father. And Grace was just the maid who'd overstepped and couldn't fix everything no matter how much she wanted to. The next day would be Lily's birthday. The next day would bring 30 children from elite schools who couldn't communicate with the birthday girl. The next day would bring entertainers performing for an audience of one who couldn't fully access their performances. The next day would bring the moment when everything that had been building, all the progress and connection and hope, would collide with the reality of Richard Hartwell's inability to see his daughter. Grace went home that night and held Marcus extra tight. "You're a good brother," she whispered, even though James was gone. "You taught me how to see people, how to really see them." Marcus, wise beyond his years, asked, "Is Lily okay?" "No," Grace admitted. "But maybe she will be. Eventually. I hope. Hope. Sometimes that's all you have. Hope that the people who need to wake up will wake up. Hope that the moments of crisis will become moments of clarity. Hope that love, even paralyzed love, even cowardly love, can find its courage. Tomorrow would test that hope. Tomorrow would break something open one way or another. Grace just prayed it would break toward healing rather than more harm. The morning of Lily's 9th birthday began with controlled chaos. The party planner arrived at 8 a.m. with a team of decorators who transformed the penthouse into something that looked like a department store had exploded. Pink everywhere. Balloons in every corner. A banner proclaiming "Happy Birthday Princess Lily" in glittering letters. Tables laden with elaborate treats arranged in towers and cascades. Lily stood in the doorway of the living room, surveying the scene with an expression Grace had learned to read. Overwhelmed, overstimulated, already shutting down. Grace, relegated to kitchen duties for the party, watched from the sidelines as Lily retreated to her room. She wanted to follow, to check on her, but Mrs. Moritz had been explicit. "Today your kitchen staff only, Mr. Hartwell's orders." He doesn't want Lily distracted from her guests. Her guests, as if 30 children who couldn't communicate with her would be anything but torture. The children began arriving at 2 p.m., dropped off by nannies and drivers, dressed in designer clothes with expensive gifts. They clustered in groups, talking to each other, largely ignoring the birthday girl who stood stiffly in the center of the room in a dress her father had chosen. A pink princess dress that Lily hated. Grace could tell by the way she kept tugging at the sleeves. Richard stood near the entrance, greeting parents, all smiles and confidence, playing the role of devoted father, performing for an audience who saw the penthouse, the party, the obvious expense, and assumed it meant love. The magician started his show. Card tricks and sleight of hand that relied heavily on patter and misdirection through words. The children laughed at jokes Lily couldn't hear. The magician kept addressing her directly, not understanding why she wasn't responding to his questions. His voice growing louder and more exaggerated until Lily's shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped around herself. The balloon artist was next, creating elaborate animals and shapes while explaining each step in running commentary. The children oohed and awed. Lily stared at the floor. Then came the princess character performer, some actress hired to portray a fairy tale character. all gestures and exaggerated expressions and songs that Lily experienced only as vibrations and confused sounds. The performer kept trying to engage Lily, waving in her face, touching her shoulder, asking questions that went unanswered. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway, her hands clenched into fists. This was torture disguised as celebration. Well-meaning torture, perhaps, but torture nonetheless. Every element of this party was designed for hearing children. Lily was a ghost at her own birthday, present but not participating, seen but not understood. She lasted 90 minutes. 90 minutes of forced smiles and confused responses and sensory overload before her face crumpled and she bolted from the room. The other children barely noticed. They were busy with the entertainment, the food, the party favors. But Grace noticed, and without asking permission, without caring about her assigned station, she followed. She found Lily in her bedroom, the door not quite closed, curled up on her bed sobbing. Not the loud, dramatic tears of a typical child, but the silent, body-racking sobs of someone who's learned that crying doesn't bring help because nobody can hear you anyway. Grace slipped inside and closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, not touching, just present. After a moment, Lily looked up, her face red and streaked with tears. Her hands moved, shaking. "I hate it. I hate all of it. Why doesn't he understand? Why doesn't he see me?" Grace felt her own eyes burn. She signed back, "I know, sweetheart. I know. Those kids don't care about me. They don't even know me. They're just here because their parents know my dad. Nobody even said happy birthday to me. Not in my language. Not in any way I could understand." Lily's signs became more agitated. Why did he do this? Why does he always do this? Because he doesn't understand, Grace signed honestly. Not yet, but maybe he'll never understand. Lily's hands slashed through the air. He doesn't want to. If he wanted to, he would have learned by now. He would have tried. But he doesn't care enough to try. The words hung in the air, devastating in their truth. Grace had no comfort to offer because Lily was right. Richard had had 3 years, countless resources, every opportunity to learn his daughter's language, and he'd chosen not to. That choice spoke louder than any excuse. "I wish you were my mom," Lily signed, fresh tears spilling. "You see me. You talk to me. You understand me. Why can't you be my mom instead?" Grace's heart shattered. She pulled Lily into her arms, held her while she cried, and tried to find words, signs, any way to explain that love couldn't be transactional, that she couldn't replace what Lily had lost, that all she could offer was presence and understanding and the promise to keep showing up as long as she was allowed. "I'm here," she signed when Lily finally pulled back. "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." It was a promise she had no authority to make. But she made it anyway. They sat together for another 20 minutes, Grace signing stories about Marcus's birthday last year, about the homemade cake that collapsed in the middle but tasted perfect anyway, about the way her whole building had shown up with dollar store gifts and enormous hearts, about how celebration wasn't about expense but about people showing up in ways that mattered. Lily listened, calmer now, her breathing evening out. "Can we have a party like that next year?" She signed. "Just us? You and Marcus and Mrs. Moritz? Can we make a cake that falls apart but tastes good?" "Yes," Grace signed, knowing she probably wouldn't be here next year, knowing this was likely her last day, but unable to deny this child one more moment of hope. "We can do exactly that." They were discussing what kind of cake, chocolate or vanilla or maybe both, when the door opened. Richard stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. Behind him, Grace could hear the party winding down, parents arriving to collect their children, the cleaning crew starting to pack up. "Grace," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "A word. In my office now." Richard's office was all glass and steel and cold efficiency. He stood behind his desk, arms crossed, while Grace stood in the doorway like a student called to the principal's office. Lily had tried to follow, but Richard had told her to stay with Mrs. Moritz, his tone brooking no argument. "You were told to remain in the kitchen," Richard began without preamble. "You were specifically instructed not to interact with Lily during the party." "She was upset," Grace said quietly. What she needed was to learn to socialize with her peers. What she needed was to participate in the celebration I'd arranged for her. What she needed was not to be coddled by staff who enable her withdrawal. Grace felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sharp. With all due respect, Mr. Hartwell, those weren't her peers. None of those children could communicate with her. Your daughter spent 90 minutes at a party where nobody spoke her language. She has to learn to exist in a hearing world, Richard said coldly. She can't hide from it forever. Existing in a hearing world doesn't mean being isolated in it. Grace shot back, forgetting caution, forgetting her place, forgetting everything except the image of Lily sobbing on her bed. It means having tools to bridge the gap. It means having people who meet her halfway. It means staff staying in their lane, Richard interrupted, his voice rising. You're the cleaning woman, Grace, not her mother, not her therapist, not her teacher. You clean floors. That's your job. That's all your job is. The words landed like a slap. Grace felt her face heat, felt the familiar sting of being reduced to her function rather than seen as a person. The cleaning woman, as if that was all she was, as if her humanity, her intelligence, her capacity for connection meant nothing beyond her ability to make floors shine. I understand, Grace said, her voice tight. I don't think you do. I think you've overstepped consistently. I think you've insinuated yourself into my daughter's life in ways that are inappropriate. I think you've undermined the structure and routine we've worked hard to establish. And I think, Richard paused, his jaw tight. I think you're using my daughter's vulnerability to manipulate your position here. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Manipulate? Mr. Hartwell, I would never. You brought your son to work. You've been signing with Lily behind my back. You've positioned yourself as some kind of savior, the only one who understands her, when really you're just a woman who learned some ASL and thinks that makes her qualified to parent someone else's child. Each word was a knife. Grace stood there, absorbing the accusations, and felt something inside her crack. Not because the words were true, but because she'd known this was coming. She'd known that connection across class lines was always dangerous, always subject to reinterpretation as manipulation, always vulnerable to being weaponized by the people with power. I care about your daughter, Grace said quietly. That's all. I saw a lonely child and You saw an opportunity, Richard said. And you took it. Well, congratulations. You've successfully disrupted my household and confused my daughter. But it ends now. You're terminated. Effective immediately. Mrs. Moritz will have your final check ready by end of day. Grace stared at him. This man who had everything and understood nothing. Mr. Hartwell, please. Lily needs stability. Lily needs professional care. Lily needs structure. She doesn't need a maid who's playing therapist. She needs someone who speaks her language. Grace's voice finally rose, months of restraint breaking. She needs someone who sees her as a person, not a problem. She needs someone who shows up, who tries, She stopped, breathing hard, knowing she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Richard's expression was ice. Get your things. Leave through the service entrance. And don't contact my daughter again. If you do, I'll consider it harassment and respond accordingly." Grace turned to leave, her hands shaking, her chest tight with fury and grief. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Hartwell, your daughter is brilliant and kind and braver than you'll ever know. And she deserves a father who can see that." She didn't wait for his response. She walked out, collected her few personal items from her locker, and left through the service entrance, just as she'd been told. Invisible on the way in, invisible on the way out. Grace was barely out of the building when the commotion started. Lily had seen her leaving, had understood what was happening, and something inside the little girl, already fragile from the disastrous party, already strained from years of isolation, finally broke completely. The meltdown was unlike anything the staff had ever witnessed. Lily wasn't just crying. She was inconsolable, unreachable, locked in a spiral of panic and grief that no one could penetrate. She threw things. She signed frantically at people who couldn't understand. She screamed without sound, her mouth open in a silent wail that was somehow more devastating than any noise could have been. Mrs. Moritz tried to calm her. The nanny tried. Richard tried, his earlier confidence evaporating into helpless panic. Nothing worked. Lily was drowning, and nobody could throw her a line because nobody spoke her language. Dr. Moss was called. She arrived within 30 minutes and found Lily unresponsive, rocking in the corner of her room, hands pressed over her face, completely withdrawn. "How long has she been like this?" Dr. Moss asked, her professional calm barely masking her concern. 20 minutes, Mrs. Moritz said, wringing her hands. "Ever since Grace left." Grace, the maid, the one who could sign. Mr. Hartwell fired her. Dr. Moss turned slowly to look at Richard, her expression carefully neutral. "You fired the person Lily was bonding with? The person who could communicate with her?" "She was overstepping," Richard said defensively. "It wasn't appropriate." "Appropriate," Dr. Moss repeated, her tone flat. "Mr. Hartwell, I've been seeing Lily for 2 years. 2 years of minimal progress, of emotional withdrawal, of isolation behaviors that nothing seemed to touch. And then suddenly 6 weeks ago, everything changed. She started engaging. She started connecting. She showed signs of genuine happiness. Did you ever wonder why?" Richard said nothing. "It was Grace," Mrs. Moritz said quietly. "Grace could sign. She talked to Lily, really talked to her. And Lily, she bloomed. She became a different child." Dr. Moss knelt beside Lily, tried to make eye contact, but the girl was unreachable. "Where's Grace now?" "Gone," Richard said. "I terminated her employment." "Then I suggest you find her," Dr. Moss said, standing. "Because right now, Lily is experiencing what looks like acute traumatic distress, and I don't have the tools to reach her. But Grace might." "I'm not going to." "Mr. Hartwell," Dr. Moss's voice was sharp. "Your daughter is in crisis. Your pride is less important than her well-being. Now, you can either find Grace or you can watch Lily spiral further. Your choice." Mrs. Moritz stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "There's something you need to see, Mr. Hartwell. Come with me." She led him to Lily's room, to the walls covered in drawings. She pulled them down one by one, laying them out in chronological order. The progression was undeniable. Dark, isolated figures gradually transforming into brighter images, empty spaces filling with connection. And then, most recently, the images growing dark again, culminating in last night's drawing. The small figure surrounded by enormous open mouths, signing into empty space. "You see this?" Mrs. Moritz pointed to a drawing from 8 weeks ago, shortly after Grace started. 2 figures, hands forming signs, labeled in Lily's careful handwriting. She sees me. And this, another drawing more recent. 3 figures, 2 adults and a child, all signing together. This is Grace, her son, and Lily, the day Marcus came to work. And this, a drawing of a single figure, arms spread wide, labeled simply, Daddy, but around the figure empty space. No connection, no communication, just isolation. Richard stared at the drawings, and something inside him finally cracked open. Not just cracked, shattered. Because laid out on the floor was the story he'd refused to see. His daughter's loneliness, his daughter's brief hope, his daughter's return to despair, all documented in the only language he'd never bothered to learn. She doesn't need more specialists, Mrs. Moritz said softly. She doesn't need more expensive programs. She needs what Grace gave her. Someone who speaks her language. Someone who sees her. Someone who tries. Richard's phone was in his hand before he fully registered the decision. He called down to security. The woman who just left, Grace Williams. Find out where she lives. Now. In the corner, Lily continued to rock, continued to hide behind her hands, continued to exist in a space nobody could reach. But maybe, just maybe, that was about to change. Because sometimes people need to break before they can rebuild. Sometimes pride needs to shatter before understanding can emerge. Sometimes the worst moments are the ones that finally force us to see what we've been refusing to look at all along. And right now, Richard Hartwell was really seeing for the first time in 3 years. The question was whether he was seeing too late. Richard Hartwell stood in his daughter's bedroom at midnight, surrounded by drawings he'd never really looked at before. The penthouse was silent. Lily was finally asleep, exhausted from hours of crying, medicated by Dr. Moss to help her rest. Mrs. Moritz had gone home. The party debris had been cleared away, and Richard was alone with the evidence of his failure. He picked up drawing after drawing, seeing them with new eyes. A small figure with hands raised, signing into emptiness. 2 figures connected by lines of communication. A dark room with a single light source labeled Grace. And the most recent one created just days ago. A figure that was clearly him, standing apart from a smaller figure that was clearly Lily with an enormous wall between them. She'd been telling him, for months, years maybe, through her art. She'd been showing him exactly what was wrong. And he'd walked past these drawings every day without seeing them, without seeing her. He thought he'd been protecting her by hiring the best professionals. He thought he'd been loving her by providing everything money could buy. But what he'd actually been doing was outsourcing his own grief and guilt, paying other people to do the work he was too afraid to do himself. Richard opened his laptop and pulled up the security footage from earlier in the day. He watched Grace follow Lily out of the party, watched her sit on the bed beside his daughter, watched their hands move in conversation he couldn't understand. Watched Lily's body language shift from complete devastation to cautious hope. Watched a connection he'd fired, dismissed, accused of manipulation. He called it overstepping. But really, it was the only stepping up that had happened in his daughter's life since Elena died. At 1 a.m., he searched for ASL tutorials. Not tomorrow. Not when work calmed down. Now, he found a video teaching basic signs and spent 3 hours practicing. His hands felt clumsy, his movements uncertain. Hello. I love you. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Over and over, until his fingers ached and the signs were imprinted in his muscle memory. At 4 a.m., he pulled up old home videos. Elena and baby Lily, Elena's hands moving in signs he'd never learned. He watched himself in the background of these videos, always on his phone, always distracted, always elsewhere even when he was present. He watched his wife's face, the way her frustration had grown over time, the way she'd stopped trying to include him. He'd blamed work, blamed timing, blamed the demands of running a company. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. He'd been afraid of failing at something that mattered more than quarterly earnings, afraid of being inadequate in a way that money couldn't fix, afraid of facing his daughter's disability and his own limitations. So he'd hidden behind work and wealth, and Elena had died, and Lily had grown up with a ghost for a father. At 6 a.m., Richard showered, dressed, and did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He left his phone on his desk, walked out of the penthouse, and took the subway. Not his driver, not his car service. The subway like a normal person, like someone who might understand what Grace Williams dealt with every day. The train was crowded with early morning workers. Cleaners and nurses and delivery people, all of them tired, all of them heading to jobs that kept the city functioning. Richard stood holding a pole, surrounded by people who would never appear in Forbes magazine, and he realized how small his world had become, how insulated, how disconnected from the reality most people lived. Grace's address, obtained from his HR files, was in the Bronx, a neighborhood Richard had never visited, had probably driven past 1,000 times without seeing. The building was old but well-maintained, the kind of place where people looked out for each other because they had to. He climbed 4 flights because the elevator was broken and stood outside apartment 4C trying to find courage he'd misplaced somewhere along the way. He knocked. Grace opened the door at 7:30 a.m., already dressed for her next job, and froze when she saw Richard Hartwell standing in her hallway. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice flat. "How did you?" "I'm sorry," Richard said. The words rushed out before he could overthink them. "I'm sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for firing you. I'm sorry for—" His voice broke. "I'm sorry for everything." Grace stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression guarded. "You came all the way to the Bronx to apologize?" "I came to beg," Richard corrected. "Lily is. He swallowed hard. "She's unreachable. Dr. Moss said she's in acute traumatic distress. She won't eat, won't sleep without medication, won't respond to anyone." And I realized, standing in her room surrounded by drawings I'd never really looked at, that I failed her. Completely. I've given her everything except what she needed most. Grace's expression softened slightly, but her posture remained defensive. And what did she need most? Someone who speaks her language. Someone who sees her. Someone who shows up. Richard's hands moved hesitantly, signing as he spoke. "Someone who tries." Grace's eyes widened. "You're learning to sign. Started last night. I'm terrible at it, but I'm trying. Finally. 3 years too late, but—" He stopped, gathering himself. "I'm not here to ask you to come back as a maid. I'm here to ask, to beg, for your help. As Lily's companion, her ASL coordinator, her bridge to a father who's been an ocean away for too long." "Why should I help you?" Grace asked quietly. "You called me a manipulator. You said I was using your daughter. You reduced me to—" She stopped, pain flashing across her face. "You made me feel like nothing." "I know." Richard's voice was raw. "I was wrong. I was defensive and scared and completely, utterly wrong. You weren't manipulating anyone. You were doing what I should have been doing all along. You were parenting my daughter better than I was, and I couldn't handle the shame of that." Grace studied him for a long moment. Behind her, Marcus appeared in the hallway, curious and protective. "Mom? You okay?" "I'm fine, baby," Grace said without turning around. Then to Richard, "If I came back, things would be different. Name your terms." "Respect," Grace said firmly. "Not as staff, but as a professional. Not as the help, but as someone whose expertise has value. Proper pay, proper title, proper recognition of what I bring. Done. And you learn ASL. Really learn it. Not a few signs to perform for guests, but actual fluency. You commit to classes, to practice, to becoming someone Lily can actually communicate with." "I'm already enrolled," Richard said. "Intensive course, 3 times a week. I'll do whatever it takes." And Grace's voice hardened. "You never, ever speak to me or anyone else on your staff the way you spoke to me yesterday. We're human beings, Mr. Hartwell. We deserve dignity regardless of what we do for a living." Richard nodded, accepting the rebuke. "You're right, and I'm sorry. It was classist and cruel and wrong." Grace was quiet for another moment, thinking. Finally, she said, "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Lily. That little girl deserves a father who sees her. And she deserves support while she waits for you to figure out how to be that person." "Thank you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Grace said. "You have a lot of work ahead of you. Learning a language is the easy part. Learning to actually connect, to be vulnerable, to show up consistently, that's the hard part. Are you ready for that?" Richard thought about the question. Was he ready? Probably not. But maybe that was the point. Maybe you didn't get ready, you just started. You just tried. You just showed up and did the work even when you were terrified of failing. "I'm ready to try," he said. Grace nodded slowly. "Then let's go see about your daughter." They returned to the penthouse together. An odd pair, the billionaire and the maid who wasn't a maid anymore. Mrs. Moritz met them at the door, her face flooding with relief when she saw Grace. "She's in her room," Mrs. Moritz said. "She won't come out, won't respond to anyone." Grace walked to Lily's door and knocked softly. No response. She opened it slowly and found Lily exactly where she'd expected. Curled on her bed, facing the wall, her small body rigid with unhappiness. Grace sat on the edge of the bed and waited. After a moment, she placed her hand gently on Lily's shoulder. The girl flinched, then turned slowly, her face swollen from crying. When she saw Grace, her expression crumpled. "You came back," Lily signed, her hands shaking. "I came back," Grace confirmed. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Daddy made you leave. He always makes everyone leave." "Your daddy made a mistake," Grace signed. "A big one, but he's trying to fix it. He's learning. Do you want to see?" Lily's face showed doubt, but also desperate hope. She nodded. Grace stood and opened the door wider. Richard stood in the hallway, his face uncertain. Grace gestured for him to enter. Richard walked slowly to Lily's bedside. He knelt down, putting himself at her eye level. And then, with hands that trembled but moved deliberately, he signed. "I'm sorry." His movements were clumsy, his hand shapes imperfect, but the meaning was clear. "I love you. Better, more practiced. Please teach me." Lily stared at her father as if seeing a stranger. Her hands rose slowly. "You're learning my language?" Richard nodded, then signed. "Yes. Should have learned long ago. I'm sorry. So sorry." And then, for the first time in 3 years, Lily launched herself into her father's arms. Not because everything was fixed, not because one apology erased years of neglect, but because he was trying. Finally trying. Richard held his daughter and cried. Not the controlled tears of a CEO at a funeral, but the messy, unguarded tears of a father who'd almost lost everything that mattered and was being given one more chance. Grace watched from the doorway, her own eyes wet. Mrs. Moritz stood beside her, dabbing at her face with a tissue. After a long moment, Lily pulled back and signed to her father. "Will you keep learning?" "Promise." Richard signed back, carefully. "I promise. Every day. Until I can talk to you about everything." "About Mama?" Lily signed. Richard's breath caught, but he nodded. "About Mama. About everything. No more hiding." Lily studied her father's face, reading the truth there. Then she signed, "Okay, but Grace stays. She helps you learn." "Grace stays," Richard confirmed, glancing at Grace for confirmation. She nodded. "And Marcus can visit?" Lily signed hopefully. "Marcus can visit whenever he wants," Richard said aloud, then fumbled through the signs. "Marcus welcome, always." Lily smiled then, tentative but real. She signed to Grace. "Can we still have our party? The small one, with cake that falls apart?" Grace smiled back. "Absolutely. Next weekend. Just us." And right there, in that expensive bedroom in that luxury penthouse, something new began. Not a fairy tale ending, because real life isn't fairy tales, but a beginning, a foundation, a choice to keep choosing, even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when you might fail. Because that's what love is, really. Not the grand gestures or the expensive parties. Not the perfect words or the flawless execution. It's showing up. It's trying. It's learning someone else's language, literally and metaphorically. Seeing people, really seeing them, and letting yourself be seen in return. And if you've stuck with this story until now, if you've felt something in these moments of connection and redemption, maybe that's because these are the stories we need more of. Stories about people choosing to see each other across lines of difference. Stories about trying even when it's hard. Stories about second chances and new beginnings. These aren't just stories, they're possibilities. They're maps showing us how healing happens, how walls come down, how love learns to speak new languages. And maybe, just maybe, sharing these stories, talking about them, keeping this conversation going, that's how we remember to keep trying in our own lives too. The work was just beginning. Richard had years of learning ahead of him. Years of showing up, practicing, failing, trying again. Grace had her own journey, navigating her new role, holding boundaries, being present for Lily while maintaining her own life and family. But they were both committed now, both willing to do the work, both understanding that the most important things in life can't be bought or delegated or postponed until a more convenient time. They could only be lived, day by day, choice by choice, one sign at a time. Spring came to New York City with the kind of gentle insistence that made even the hardest surfaces seem softer. Trees budded along Central Park. Windows opened to let in air that didn't quite hurt. And in a classroom at the Manhattan School for the Deaf, Lily Hartwell prepared for her first public presentation. 6 months had passed since that terrible birthday, since the breaking point, since the moment everything changed. 6 months of hard work, of daily choices, of slowly, carefully building something new from the rubble of what had been broken. Grace Williams sat in the audience, wearing professional clothes that actually fit, no longer the uniform of invisibility, but the wardrobe of someone whose work was valued. Next to her sat Marcus, growing taller every day it seemed, already talking about high school programs and engineering camps he'd never dreamed he could afford before. On her other side, Mrs. Moritz, who now knew enough ASL to have full conversations with Lily about recipes and favorite books and what it meant to really listen. And beside Mrs. Moritz, looking nervous in a way billionaires rarely looked, sat Richard Hartwell. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't mentally reviewing quarterly projections, wasn't anywhere except right here, right now, waiting to watch his daughter present her project to her class and invited family members. His ASL had improved dramatically. 3 times a week lessons had become daily practice. He signed with Lily over breakfast, stumbling sometimes, but trying. He signed with her therapist during their family sessions. He signed with Grace when he needed help understanding something complex. He'd even hired a deaf consultant at his company and started funding accessibility initiatives he'd never considered before. The changes weren't just linguistic. Richard had stepped back from some of his CEO duties, promoting his COO to handle daily operations so he could be present for Lily's life. Mornings, dinners, school events, the small moments that built trust and connection. He'd learned that being a father wasn't about providing, it was about showing up. He and Grace had developed a working relationship built on mutual respect. She coordinated Lily's ASL education, connected the family with the deaf community, helped Richard navigate a world he'd ignored for too long. She had her own office in the penthouse now, a proper salary, benefits, and the title of Family ASL Coordinator and Cultural Liaison. She still lived in the Bronx by choice, but a better apartment, and Marcus was enrolled in a STEM program that would have been impossible before. But the biggest change, the one that mattered most, sat at the front of the classroom preparing to present. Lily. She wore clothes she'd chosen herself. Not princess dresses, but practical jeans and a shirt with a geometric pattern she designed. Her hair was pulled back simply. She looked confident, connected, present in a way she'd never been in that isolated penthouse. She attended the Manhattan School for the Deaf now, surrounded by children who signed, teachers who understood, a community where she wasn't the problem to be solved, but simply one student among many. She had friends, real friends who invited her to sleepovers and birthday parties and shared secrets in rapid ASL that made them giggle. And she still drew, but the drawings had transformed completely. Now they showed connection, community, hands forming bridges between people. Her latest series, displayed on the classroom walls, was titled The Languages We Speak, and it showed different forms of communication. ASL, spoken language, art, music, dance, all of them valid, all of them beautiful. The presentation began. Lily stood at the front of the classroom, her hands moving with fluid confidence as she signed her speech. Her teacher interpreted for the hearing guests, but Richard didn't need the interpretation. He understood enough now to follow his daughter's words. My project is about invisible people, Lily signed. About how we all become invisible sometimes, for different reasons. I was invisible because I'm deaf and people didn't learn my language. Other people are invisible because of their race or their job, or because society decides they don't matter. Grace felt her chest tighten, recognizing her own story in Lily's words. But then someone saw me, Lily continued, her hands graceful and certain. Someone learned my language. Someone chose to build a bridge instead of a wall. And that changed everything. Not just for me, but for my dad too. He learned that seeing people, really seeing them, is the most important thing we can do. Lily's hands paused, then continued. My dad started a foundation 6 months ago. It's called the Elena and James Foundation, named after my mama and after the brother of the person who first saw me. The foundation helps deaf children from families who can't afford ASL classes. It trains teachers. It builds bridges. Richard wiped his eyes, not caring who saw. Elena would have loved this. James would have loved this. 2 people gone but not forgotten. Their names living on in work that mattered. I learned that we all have the power to see each other. Lily signed, her expression serious and wise beyond her 9 years. We just have to choose to look. We have to choose to learn. We have to choose to build bridges instead of walls. And when we do, when we really see each other, that's when everything changes. The presentation ended. The classroom erupted in applause, hands raised and waving in the air. the deaf community's visual applause that looked like celebration made physical. Lily looked directly at Grace and signed, "Thank you for seeing me." Grace signed back, "Thank you for letting me." Then Lily turned to her father and signed, "Thank you for learning to see me." Richard stood, walked to his daughter, and signed with hands that no longer trembled. "Thank you for not giving up on me. I love you. Every day. Forever." Father and daughter embraced while the applause continued, and Grace thought about how far they'd all come. How a single moment of connection, one person choosing to see another, had created ripples that spread outward in ways nobody could have predicted. She'd come to that penthouse 6 months ago expecting just another job, another wealthy family, another space where she'd be invisible. But instead, she'd found Lily. And in seeing Lily, she'd somehow been seen herself. Two invisible people, recognizing each other, had created something neither could have created alone. The foundation was helping dozens of families now. Richard's company had become a leader in accessibility. Marcus had opportunities Grace had never dreamed possible. Mrs. Moritz was learning ASL and teaching it to other household staff. Dr. Moss was incorporating the success story into her practice, helping other families understand the power of meeting children where they were. And Lily, brilliant, beautiful, brave Lily, was thriving in a community that spoke her language and saw her worth. After the presentation, they all went out for lunch. Not to some expensive restaurant where Lily would feel out of place, but to a diner in the neighborhood, the kind of place with vinyl booths and bottomless coffee and waitstaff who were learning basic ASL because Lily and her classmates came there every week. They sat together, this unlikely chosen family. The billionaire, the former maid, the 2 children, the housekeeper. They talked, signed, laughed, existed in that space where all the labels fell away and they were just people. Just humans seeing each other, connecting across every difference, building bridges one conversation at a time. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Marcus signed to Lily, his hands now fluent after months of practice. Lily thought for a moment, then signed, "A bridge builder, like Grace, someone who helps people see each other." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You already are," she signed back. "You already are." As they left the diner, walking out into the spring sunshine, Richard caught Grace's arm gently. "I want to ask you something," he signed and spoke simultaneously. "The foundation needs a director, someone who understands both worlds, who can bridge communities, who has the vision and heart to really make a difference. Would you consider it?" Grace stared at him. "Mr. Hartwell, Richard," he corrected. "And before you answer, know that this isn't charity. You've already proven you can do this work. You've changed our lives. You could change hundreds more, thousands eventually, but only if you want to, only if it's right for you and Marcus." Grace looked at her son, at Lily, at this life that had emerged from a single choice to see someone who was being overlooked. She thought about all the other children like Lily, all the other families like the Hartwells, all the other invisible people waiting for someone to build a bridge. "Yes," she said, signing as she spoke. "Yes, I'll do it. Because that's how change happens. Not in grand dramatic gestures, but in daily choices. In learning new languages. In seeing people who society has trained us to overlook. In building bridges instead of walls. In showing up again and again even when it's hard. And maybe wherever you are right now, you know someone who's invisible. Someone whose language you haven't learned. Someone who's waiting for a bridge. Maybe you're that invisible person yourself, waiting for someone to see you. These stories, these connections, they're happening everywhere all the time. We just have to choose to look, choose to learn, choose to build. So here's what I want to ask you. Who have you seen recently that others overlooked? Who built a bridge to you when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, what this story meant to you, what invisible people in your life deserve to be seen. Because these aren't just stories. They're invitations. They're possibilities. They're maps showing us the way back to each other. One person, one connection, one choice at a time.